Chapter 4, Section 2, Big Business and Organized Labor. So before the Civil War, most businesses were still small and owners knew all their employees. This was called a sole proprietorship. But as businesses expanded and the population expanded in the United States during the Industrial Revolution, businesses were not owned by just one person. They were owned by a corporation, which is a business owned by many investors in the company. There wasn't just one big boss, but many, kind of like a board of directors, kind of owned the business. So corporations had many individuals have stock, and stock is part ownership of the company. So one person was not taking all the risk. So you can buy stock in Apple or any kind of business, and that means makes you a part owner. Now, if you buy a stock of Apple, that's only a small piece of a very large pie, but technically you're a part owner. And so people buy and sell their shares or their ownership in companies. And also, it's easier for corporations to receive loans from banks because it's not just one individual trying to secure a loan. So it's a much lower risk for banks to loan to businesses. That's a corporation. So these big businesses, before the start of the 1900s, the government rarely made regulations on the practices of businesses. Particularly, they made no regulations to stop monopolies, which monopoly is a company that controls most of or all of their business in particular. The industry has no competition. It's kind of like the game of Monopoly. You want to try to control the whole entire board, have no competition, everybody pays you. That's in the monopoly. And monopolies, they have complete control. They have control over the price of that good. So really, rarely does the customer ever win out when there's a monopoly because the prices are usually higher and there's no competition to force them to lower their price. So Andrew Carnegie, you should know him, especially there's a town called Carnegie in Pittsburgh. But anyways, he immigrated from Scotland to Pittsburgh when he was a young man. He was smart but poor, Scottish immigrant but Carnegie worked his way up into some money through the railroad industry. And Carnegie's business plan was to monopolize the steel industry by owning all the resources to make the steel. So Carnegie owned the iron mines and coal mines around Pittsburgh. He owned the steel mills themselves, the railroads, and the shipping lanes that transported the steel. So from A to Z, he owned everything in the process. So he didn't have to pay anybody. He didn't have to pay any good service. He owned it all. So, like I said, from start to finish, he controlled the steel manufacturing industry. That's kind of an example of one of the steel mills in Pittsburgh. You have the stacks. Obviously, the pollution from making that much steel because you're burning that coal. There's rail lines coming in to transport the steel. But that's what the steel mills used to look like. So Carnegie was ruthless and a great businessman, and he actually, in Pittsburgh, we're producing more steel than pretty much the entire world at one point, and all the mills in England, no less. But Carnegie was a ruthless businessman. He made a fortune in the steel industry. But as he was getting older, he was thinking that life wasn't all about money, so he believed in this gospel of wealth, which believed that the rich had a duty to improve society. It was kind of like if you have a lot of money and you can help people, then you should. So Carnegie donated hundreds of millions of dollars to build libraries, theaters, and donated mass sums to charities. Carnegie also found Carnegie Mellon University and Carnegie Hall, and so the town of Carnegie is named after him. So a lot of stuff in Pittsburgh is named Carnegie, and Carnegie Science Center. That all comes from Carnegie himself. So John D. Rockefeller, he grew up poor in upstate New York and then moved to Cleveland, Ohio to be a bookkeeper. At a young age, he invested in an oil refinery, and with the profits from the oil refinery, Rockefeller began to buy small oil companies, began to buy them up, and he combined these smaller oil companies to form one bigger company called Standard Oil. And Rockefeller aimed at creating a monopoly in the oil industry. He wanted to be the only oil company in the United States. And he was successful. Now, his methods of rooting out the competition wasn't always like he would burn down their factory or do something shady, but he always got his way and he always bought out other companies and he was the sole oil supplier. So he was able to also cut prices because and anybody that tried to take on Standard Oil would just not succeed. He ended all the competition in the oil industry and had complete control. He had a true monopoly. So there was a Standard Oil Trust, which is the large oil corporate that he created. The large oil corporation that owned all the facets of the oil refining, the oil fields, the oil refineries, the processing, and the transportation. But what a trust really is a group of corporations that are run by a board of directors. So everything for A to Z for the Standard Oil was all together in this corporation, this trust. But trusts do not allow for any competition because it's hard to break in when one company owns everything in the steps of processing a good or service. And Rockefeller's net worth was about $420 billion. At its peak, he was definitely the richest man in American history. Even though his methods of gaining that wealth weren't always great, but he was worth so much money at the height of his power. But he did donate much of his money to charity. Big business or trusts were seen as a threat to America's free enterprise. You're supposed to have a free market. There's supposed to be a lot of competition, a lot of options. Having just one oil company wasn't good. It was against the American way. Consumers didn't win because, just like in our area, you can have Verizon or Comcast internet. If you didn't have competition, you'd just be stuck with one and you'd be paying that one price, and which is just not the American way, and that's not how our American economy is built. And so Carnegie and Rockefeller were seen as robber barons who unfairly destroyed their competition. Also, I believe that they would kind of line the pockets of politicians with bribes. As you can see here, you shake their hand, like this is what's going to happen, especially with, like regulations and land dealings. Just give the politicians some money and they'll be on your side. So with all these big business and all these factories and everything, companies just had hundreds, and sometimes thousands of workers or employees. So when you have that many workers, employees, they didn't want to pay them that much money. So they hired poor immigrants because they were willing to work for low pay. So it's all about, when these big businesses, it's all about maximizing profit, maximizing how much money you can make off your product. Women worked in textile mills, clothing manufacturing. They were called sweatshops, where you see all these people packed into one small room. It's hot. They're making these garments and they're working hard, working long hours, and it's kind of dangerous. Children worked there as well. Sometimes around 5, 6 years old, they were out working. Children that worked in the factories did not have time to go to school. So it seemed like there was this endless cycle of poverty because they would be in school. They wouldn't be allowed to go to school. And so therefore they couldn't learn anything new. And then so that the only jobs that they could have was these laborers in these terrible conditions. So it was a vicious cycle. So you can see this kid's not even wearing shoes. It's super dangerous working conditions. Poorly clothed. They don't really have safety glasses or gloves or anything like that. So men often perform very dangerous work in factories and mines too. Steel mills were super dangerous. There was little to no safety precautions. The workers eventually wanted change. And workers began to organize and form unions and to attempt to receive better pay, working conditions from their owners. So these labor unions, they come together. It's called labor union. These organizations are formed by workers of the company to protect their rights as workers. And really, their goals were safer working conditions, higher wages, and shorter working hours. So the first labor union really was the Knights of Labor in 1869, and it included workers from all different professions: railroad, steel workers, textile, you name it. Included men, women, African Americans. Everybody was able to join. Thousands of people. But the general public disliked the unions because of the series of violent labor disputes. A lot of times this happened because of strikes, in which a strike is a refusal to work as a form of protest against unfair practices. So you go on strike if you want change. So everybody has to agree to not work because a company can't function without the workers. So that's their bargaining chip. So the workers won't work until they get what they want. So they usually don't end until the protesters receive what they want, or a concession from their employers. So they won't go back to work until some agreement or compromise have been made. The Knights of Labor Union disbanded after a strike rally turned violent at Haymarket Square in Chicago. The Haymarket Square riot, so they were rioting for better pay and better hours, and then someone threw this bomb into the big crowd, and it killed some police, and the police then fired into the people. 8 officers were killed, and several members of the protesters, and it was just a mess. And the unions kind of received a bad connotation after this, and the Knights of Labor disbanded. So Samuel Gompers founded at the same year this new union, the American Federation of Labor, and it replaced the Knights of Labor, and only skilled workers were allowed in. They thought that to make the first union really successful, only skilled laborers, people with good minds, education, they could make the first successful one, and then other ones can build off of that. It wasn't for those manual labor workers. It was just for like the skilled people, and even African Americans weren't allowed to join. But they used this collective bargaining, which is the negotiation between management for the workers to get what they want instead of these violent strikes that just didn't work. As you can see, the two people, the workers and the owners working together. And this American Federation of Labor was really the first union to be successful, and they would pave the way for other successful labor unions: the Carpenters Union, the Auto Workers Union, and the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. So I think all the unions kind of say thanks to the American Federation of Labor. That was really the first successful union. All right, that concludes Chapter 4, Section 2.